Good morning. Welcome to Hometown Heroes. I'm Rick Irving with my co-host Mary Staffeld.
Good
And
morning.
Mary, we have a special guest today.
We do. And Tony Funtanilla is one of our newer members of Roll Call. I can't remember how long you've been apart.
About 4 years.
Yeah. So we've been around since 2014. So,
Mm.
and Tony has been there and silently. And every time I looked at Tony's record in our computer where it gives us a little bit of their service details, I'm like, I got him on a list and I need to talk to him about speaking at roll call. And then last luncheon, he comes up and he gives
Yeah.
me a copy of his book, which I'm getting ready to break open, but I'm going to get to hear some stories today. And that's when I said, hey, I've been meaning to talk to you about speaking. And then we talked about hometown heroes because we get to give him, obviously we've got a little bit more time here than we have at the luncheon. So Tony is one of our Vietnam veterans, and we
Yes.
are really excited about having you here today.
Well, thanks for
Absolutely.
having me. I'm honored.
I got to kind of go over some of Tony's stories from the time he was in the Army and in Vietnam, and just he has some incredible stories, and you saw a lot of things that kids don't need to see because you were fairly young when you went in the Army. So
Yeah. Yeah. I
yeah,
turned 18. They had to register for the draft and went over to Vietnam when I was 19. So,
kind of baptism by fire. But you grew up in the Bay Area of California, didn't you?
yes, Oakland, California is where I was born and pretty much lived on that side of the Bay Area.
And you had a brother that was in Vietnam also
Yes.
before
Yes.
you
He was
went.
there right before I went over. Exactly. Yeah.
So he was in the army, then you went in the army while he was in
Mhm.
Vietnam.
Both. Yeah. Both of us were infantry over there. He actually did his 12-month tour, but he knew I probably would be going over. And so he extended an extra 6 months, thinking that that would prevent me from having to go over. But as it turned out, I still had to go. And I was a couple of months into my tour when I think the government finally passed some kind of law that no two people from the same home could go to Vietnam within 12 months of each other. But I was already there. Too late.
You went to Fort Lewis, Washington for basic, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So that's not too far from home, but I mean it's a long drive, but it's not like going to Fort Dix, New Jersey, or something like that. So
No, but all I remember about Fort Lewis was it was wet.
all the time,
nothing,
huh?
nothing but rain. Yes.
And then you went to AIT down at Fort Hood.
Fort Hood. Yes.
So
Yeah.
was that the first time you'd been to Texas?
Actually, it was. It's the first time I'd been to Washington and the first time I'd been to Texas. And um, I'd always heard that, Texas was big. And I thought when I got to Fort Hood, it's a big lot of nothing.
Fort Hood's pretty big.
It's
Yes, it
massive.
is. Yeah,
How
nothing but.
how how long were you at Fort Hood? You did your AIT, and then did you stay over some?
Yes, I got to Fort Hood. I want to say December '66 after basic, and then stayed in Fort Hood. Went through AIT and all that until we shipped out, which would have been in the fall of '67. So
Okay,
it was there
so
quite a long time. Yeah,
were were you in the Army for 2 years or 3 years, or how long were
two
you
years,
in? Okay,
two
so
years. Yeah.
did you get drafted or volunteer for the draft, or
It's kind of a funny story. Like I said, my brother was in the service before me, and when he came on home for leave before he shipped over to Vietnam, he would tell me about his, being able to shoot weapons, throw hand grenades, and all the crazy camaraderie that he had with his, buddies. I also got to try on his real Army uniform. I thought that was pretty cool. because growing up as kids, we'd always play Army and pretend and do this. And there's kind of a saying, nobody ever played Navy as a kid. So, but after trying on his uniform and hearing all his stories, I considered, I was a senior in high school at the time, and I thought, I'm not really one to study and buckle down. Maybe I might consider going into the Army after high school. Well, when I turned 18, that was in 1966. In August, I had to register for the draft, and I asked the person at the draft board when the next draft call was going to be. And again, that was in August, and he said, well, it's next month in September. And I said, well, go ahead and put me on it, thinking that if I went Navy, Air Force, or anything else, I was going to look at a minimum of 3 years. And I just wanted to put my 2 years in. So I figured if I got drafted, that was a good way to just get my 2 years in. So
just go in and get it done and get it over with.
Get it over with, and I wasn't really serious about studying for college and all that. I knew eventually I would get drafted, but like you said, I thought, well, let's just get it over with. So had no idea what I was getting into.
Had your father or grandfathers been in the military?
Yes, actually, my maternal grandfather was in the Spanish-American War.
Wow.
My background is Filipino, so, and the joke was, well, whose side was he on? My dad, when he came over from the Philippines, he was, I think, well, technically he was on record, he was 18, but in reality, he was only 16. But when World War II broke out, he went into the Navy and served in the Navy during World War II as a gunner's mate, I think it was, on a ship. And he was inside the gun turret, helping to shoot the gun. I don't know exactly what his official job was, but looking back, he never really talked about his military service other than, being on a ship and
Do you know if he was he on the Pacific, or in the Atlantic? Did he do the Pacific. South Pacific? Okay. Did he end up going back to the Philippines during the war?
Not actually. My mother, she was born in Hawaii, and they were living in Central California, close to, you mentioned Salinas, that's close to that area. And my dad, I guess he was home on leave before shipping out, and that's when he met my mother, and eventually they got married and all that. But yeah, he served his time, and after the war, he was granted citizenship for having served, which was, pretty good.
That was pretty good.
So, yeah.
So whenever you were at Fort Hood is whenever they reactivated the Americal Division, correct?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Okay. And I don't know when they stood down, but whenever you're at a place where they reactivated a division, it's kind of a big deal. I was there when they reactivated the 7th Infantry Division, and I started out in the 7th Medical Battalion. And so, it was just a handful of us that started there in the medical battalion. So, we had an E6 for the first sergeant and a second lieutenant for the CO, and then 2 weeks later we'd have an E7 come in, and then a first lieutenant, and then a captain. So everybody kind of, you got to know everybody, and then every week or two you'd have somebody new until you had all the ranks in place that should be there. So. And then had the big parade and on the parade field to do the reactivation ceremony, because the 7th had stood down in Korea, and so they reactivated in 1975. So at Fort Ord, California. Yeah. Did you ever go to Fort Ord?
Well, the Americal Division. Actually, no. Okay. My brother did.
Okay.
He spent some time in Fort Ord. Actually, he spent, when he got out of the service, I guess somebody messed up on the paperwork, but he was ordered to do reserve duty in Fort Ord. And then he found out later that because he served, in combat, that he wasn't supposed to do reserve duty, but he'd
Got a
already.
little extra time.
Good point. And a
What
little
were
extra
you
time, yes.
Yeah. What were you going to say about the Americal Division?
Yeah, after the Vietnam War, I think the Americal Division really hadn't heard anything about it, so I think they were stood down. But when Desert Storm broke out, that's when they got called up again, and Schwarzkopf and the whole thing with the Americal Division of the Army there in Iraq.
So you start out in the mechanized infantry, but then it changed over. They took all your tracks away, and you became the infantry before you went to Vietnam, correct?
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
And
Yeah.
what unit?
sorry?
What unit were you with? Your unit?
Before we became infantry. Yeah, before we became infantry, we were 2nd Armored Division, and then they changed us and started the 198th Infantry. And of course, we didn't like that idea because we thought it'd be nice and safe to be inside an armored vehicle. But once we got to Vietnam and we had to occasionally work with an armored unit, we found out that the tanks and APCs are nothing but bullet magnets. So thankfully we could hide in the jungle, not being in those vehicles.
Well, whenever you did go to Vietnam, on the way you kind of stopped off and spent a few extra days before you went to Vietnam, didn't you?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And that was to see your brother.
I had a 2-week leave to go visit family, and I knew that my brother was getting out of or was coming home sometime during then, and I decided I didn't want to go without seeing my brother, so I went AWOL for a week. And during that week, he was processing out of Oakland, California. We lived in a city called San Leandro, which was about a 20-minute drive from Oakland. So I hopped in my dad's car and drove to the Oakland Army base and found my brother and told him, I said, hey, we got to go to the Red Cross office because I'm AWOL. And he thought, what are you, an idiot? But so we went to the Red Cross office, and I told them my situation, said I'm AWOL. They called my company commander and verified, yes, his brother's here. We saw his paperwork. He is processing out. He just got back from Vietnam. And so she gave me the phone to talk to my company commander. He thankfully was very sympathetic. And he said, well, I understand that the likelihood of 2 brothers serving one after the other, the second brother, the likelihood of him coming home in one piece, odds are kind of against you. So he actually said, I'm going to excuse you from being AWOL. I'm going to give you 3 more days but you better show up, to your unit when your time is up, because otherwise you're going to be court-martialed. And that was really, really a nice thing for him to do. And it really upped my respect for him. And I thought, this is a kind of commander that I would gladly follow into a battle. Further on down the road, once we got to Vietnam, unfortunately, I ended up accidentally shooting him. And it was a friendly fire incident. We were in one area moving at night, and the clouds were kind of hiding the moonlight. We were walking in an area that was full of waist-high brush, and it was just noisy. We're having a hard time navigating. And about a month before that, I had been on loan to another platoon, and we'd worked that area. And so I made my way up to the captain, and I told him, look, I've been here before. About 200 yards off to the left, there's a trail that we can get on and get out of this noisy brush. And he said, well, go ahead and lead on. So I took point, and the rest of the company followed me. And I'm walking on the trail, and ahead of me, the brush started getting taller, more head height, and I could hear some rustling off in front of me, and I halted the column and got down on my knee and waited, and I eventually saw a rifle poke out of the bush, and then an arm, and then pretty soon a full silhouette. And so I flicked the safety off my weapon and fired off 3 rounds, and the body dropped. And I waited to make sure that it was safe to move forward and investigate. And so I crawled up towards the body, and I realized that it was my captain, the same captain that excused me from AWOL. And what had happened was he and the radio man, for some dumb reason that he admitted himself eventually, chose to move forward and rendezvous with us up on that trail, which didn't really make sense because he should have told somebody that he was going to try that. And anyway, that's how we ended up rendezvousing at the same point. And while I was over his body and just in a panic because I told everybody, it's Captain Bradley, I shot him. Didn't realize that while I was talking, his radio man was in the bush with his weapon pointed at my head, ready to shoot until he heard my voice. And he started yelling, don't shoot, it's me. And he came out of the bush. And it was just a really ugly night. Anyway, so we called for medevac, and I had to ride in the chopper with him because I needed to go back to base camp, and they wanted to investigate the situation. Back at base camp, I had an opportunity to go see Captain in the hospital, and even in his groggy state, he kept apologizing, as I kept apologizing, saying it was his fault, it was a dumb decision, don't worry about it, don't feel bad, but here he is lying there doped up. And what had happened is one of my rounds went through his stomach. Fortunately, I think it just pierced one of his organs. Another round lodged in his spine, and the third round shot off his genitals. Which, that was a horrible. Anyway, long story short, it was, I think, about maybe 10, 15 years after I got out that I'd heard that he committed suicide because he couldn't go on living without the use of his legs and without being able to father any children with his wife. And of course, again, knowing that it wasn't really my fault, still just living with the idea that I was the one that pulled the trigger was a very, very hard thing to get over, especially when his story ended the way it did. So, but it took a lot of years to finally realize, that's, again, not something that was my fault or that I needed to carry for the rest of my life.
You had been there for a while before that happened, correct? I mean, you weren't just the new kid on the block.
Actually, no, that was that was actually I want to say probably been there about 4 months, 3 months. So I wasn't really a rookie or an FNG, sorry, but yeah. So I had enough experience under my belt because, like I said, I'd substituted with another platoon in that same area. I ended up I got shuffled around a few times because there was a lot of loss of field leadership, a lot of squad leaders and so forth. And so, whenever somebody had a bunch of replacements that needed training and or another platoon or company that needed a squad leader, they would shuffle us around just to kind of fill in the gaps. But yeah, I probably had about 3 or 4 months under my belt when that happened.
Okay, so you kind of knew. I mean, it wasn't like you were the rookie, but they made you a squad leader pretty soon after you got there, didn't they? I mean, you hadn't been there a long time.
Yes. Yeah. Basically, because of the Tet Offensive, here I was, a 19-year-old by that time. They made me an E5, and I went from a PFC to an E5 from an E3 to an E5 in one big jump. And all of a sudden, here I am in charge of 6 to 8 other lives and have to tell them what to do and, train the replacements, so forth. So yeah, it was talk about a fast track to becoming an old man.
Whenever you got over there, then whenever you go out into the field and the jungles, you go out there sometime as a company, but sometime as a platoon, or and then break down into
Yes.
smaller units.
Exactly.
And you're
Yes.
right out there in
Yeah.
helicopters.
Yes. We get choppered out to an LZ or a fire base, and then from there they would launch operations where it would either be company size operations to patrol an area, or like you mentioned, they'd break us up into platoon units to work a certain area.
And to begin with, you were kind of
So
where there was a lot of rice paddies and it kind of in the lowlands whenever you got there, and then you went on into the highlands and then over by Laos.
yeah, I would exactly. Yeah, basically my area, I was up in what's called I-Corps, which is right up to the DMZ. From Chulai, which was our base headquarters, all the way up to the DMZ, from the coast all the way to the Laotian border. That was our area of operation. So more closer to Chulai was more of the flatland, the rice paddies, villages, so forth. And then as we get closer to the Laotian side, it was more hilly, mountainous, jungle. So we actually served in both types of terrain.
Yeah. What was your
personally? I preferred the jungle because I could.
Yeah, your primary
I was going to
focus
say
was
personally,
your primary focus was to engage the enemy, or just look for the enemy, or to report back reconnaissance, or a little bit of everything.
A little bit of everything, and actually, I thought that our platoon's nickname should have been Charlie 3 Bait, because they always sent us out and so-called intel. We'd have to go check it out, and if we got shot at, then that confirmed, yes, they're out there. But no, a lot of our engagement was, first we got shot at, and then we would engage. So. But yeah, there was a lot of it. Even getting sent to, we weren't supposed to be in Laos, but we got sent there and accidentally, so to speak, given the wrong coordinates. So we would be in Laos looking for evidence of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And of course, whenever we were in Laos and we got discovered, and a lot of times we were overrun because we were just either a platoon or a company size unit, but we were discovered by just a brigade or so, or larger, of North Vietnamese coming in. We couldn't get any air support, not artillery, not jets or gunships or anything, because we weren't supposed to be in Laos. And our orders were just run back to the border, and then we can get some support. And unfortunately, a lot of times we had to really just pick up and run. We had to leave our dead behind sometimes, and the severely wounded, we had to leave. Otherwise, we wouldn't survive, and we just had to run or carry our wounded with us.
That was tough to do,
once we
wasn't it?
got close enough to the border, then we fall into the fire mission. Very tough, yeah, and it was something that we, soon just became angry, and a lot of, our attitude was just anger and rage, because if you're not angry, if you're not full of rage, you're going to be full of fear, and you won't be able to function. So, yeah, and I think that's what carries with a lot of combat veterans in life after combat is you develop that that persona so much, and convince yourself that, anything that ticks you off, you're going to, feel aggressive towards. And it's hard to unlearn that. It takes a while to become civilized.
I've heard several fellows that were in battle like you in Vietnam, and they said that we became animals. Did you feel that way? That it was just like being an attack dog and aggressive all the time, and
Yeah. Well, and for me personally, I started seeing people get wounded, get killed, and I figured, you could be hiding behind a big boulder, and if it's your time to go, you're going to go. And my thinking was, and I guess it's what helped me survive, was if I'm going to get it, they're going to have to earn it, and I'm going to take as many with me as possible. And that sounds cliche, but it's true. They're going to have to earn getting me. And in the meantime, you just have to be aggressive and violent and fast. Otherwise, you don't survive, And you learn it, you take your 12 months over there, and you learn it so well that it's hard to unlearn it when you get out.
Mm. Yeah, probably. I was going to say,
And
Rick's probably got the
again,
best.
that's one of my reasons for writing that.
do you remember?
Yeah, and that was my reason for writing that book was people need to know. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What was your first book? Your first book?
First book was called Parables. Yeah, Parables from Combat, and it came about once I was getting involved in going to church and all that, and would hear different scriptures. Sometimes they would remind me of something I experienced in Vietnam, and I would share that with the study group or whoever I was with, and most of the times they said, "Wow, that really kind of paints a more vivid picture of what the scripture is talking about." For instance, something as simple as being alert all the time, spiritually speaking. Well, that reminded me of like when we first got there, and first time we got sniped at. The enemy, the Viet Cong, would maybe use one or two people to shoot at us, and of course we'd all jump up and go chasing after where the threat came from. And once we were convinced that the threat was over, we would sit down, drop our rifles, open up our sea rations, eat, smoke, relax, whatever. Well, that's when the Viet Cong would then launch a larger attack and catch us fully unprepared to protect ourselves. Anyway, I would share that with the Bible study group, and then they thought, oh yeah, well that makes sense. Always be alert, don't relax, and put it down. And as I would share these experiences, people said, you got to write those things down, and maybe make a book or something. I write a book. I barely passed English in high school, and I'm not an avid reader. Why would I want to write a book? I'm not qualified. But eventually, I felt convinced in my spirit that that's something I should do, and that's how that first book came about. So,
and that was
had several people said.
How far into your journey after Vietnam did you start kind of dealing with the healing process that you've been through?
Well, when I was in Vietnam, I began to question God. Why did this good person have to die such a horrific death? Why did this dirtbag of a guy survive? And I just started believing that God was either a liar, he wasn't fair, he wasn't compassionate, and so I felt, I don't want anything to do with this God. And so when I got out of the Army in 1968, it wasn't until I want to say maybe 1983. So we're looking at 20 some odd years of not acknowledging God, not going to church, none of that. But and it's kind of a long story. I did kind of outline it in my second book, but we, my wife and I had at least the wisdom, or she had the wisdom to send my stepdaughter, who at the time was, I think, 5 or 4 years old, to a Christian school so she'd get some kind of training. Now, my wife and I, neither one of us were going to church or acknowledging God. She grew up in a Church of Christ church that was very, dogmatic. You're going to go to hell, and you're a sinner and all that. So she didn't have any desire to go, but at least, she was prompted to start our daughter Jennifer at a a Baptist school. Anyway, so Jennifer would come home one day, and she was excited and said, Mom, I got saved. And of course, my wife and I, not knowing what that meant, we thought, well, what happened? You got saved. Are you okay? And she said, no, I accepted Jesus into my heart. And we thought, well, that's nice. My wife said, well, that's good, honey. Again, we both had no idea what that meant. And so we just kind of brushed it off, but our Jennifer kept asking, how come we don't go to church? And we would say, yeah, maybe someday we'll go. But eventually, one of my wife's sisters started going to a local non-denominational church, and she told my wife, Debbie, wow, you got to come check this church out because it's so different than what we grew up with. I mean, it talks about God is a loving God, and the whole thing of no condemnation and all that. So she convinced my wife to go one Sunday. And of course, my wife came home and said, wow, you should check this out. It's so different. And of course, yeah, good for you. I don't need that. And I would resist all her invitations to go. But a couple of weeks after her going, I started to notice her attitude, her countenance started to seem more at peace, more joyful. And so I started thinking maybe I should go check that out because it might be a cult, it might be some crazy Jesus freak place. And I went there and checked it out. And before the service started, I sat there with arms crossed saying, look at all these hypocrites trying to pretend like they're nice, fun people and all that. And at the time, I was playing guitar and singing in dinner houses and lounges. And I thought, I'll just go ahead and check this out. Anyway, the church started their worship music, and I started feeling all of a sudden the urge to cry, and I couldn't understand why. Well, I tried to logic my way through the experience by thinking, in the dinner house that I played at the Saturday night, when the restaurant closed, all of us in the restaurant would gather at the bar and we'd party, because the bar was open and it was free. And I thought, well, the reason why I was feeling like crying was because I was probably too hungover and my nervous system ragged. And that's probably why. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to try it again next week, and I'm not going to, party like I did and see what happens. And long story short, the same thing happened again. I sat there, the music started, and I started to really feel broken. So, I just continued going and eventually started listening and paying attention to the messages and all that, and eventually did invite Jesus into my heart. Not really understanding what it was all about, but that was probably 1984. And that's when I say my whole journey of being restored back to a civil, peaceful person really began. But, in all honesty, it took several decades to finally understand and surrender the things I needed to surrender. And so now here, 30 some odd years later, I finally am starting to feel content with the man I believe I was created to be. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that was that beginning of the journey.
Because you suffered a lot of post-traumatic syndrome from seeing all the people get killed, all your people get wounded, and having to leave the dead and some of the wounded. You know, that was a horrible experience for anybody, but much less somebody that was 19 or 20 years old. You know, how did you deal with that at the time? I mean, I guess it was just survival.
Yeah, you know, and the way I like to explain it was every time we either did something or witnessed something that was just horrible. Um, Back then, you know, we had a saying, "Don't mean nothing." In other words, you convince yourself, you know, don't dwell on it, don't let it sink in. And it was like, in my case, I felt like, you know, I would start building this sandbag bunker around my heart to protect it because it hurt too much. You make friends and you lose them and all that. And that, you know, everybody had ways of kind of numbing up, because if you didn't numb up, you couldn't function, you couldn't lead, you couldn't fight, you know. So you'd find your own individual ways to numb up, and mine was these mental sandbags I was adding to my bunker that surrounded my heart. The only problem is once that bunker gets that fortification gets so well built, it wasn't until after I got out of the service and started realizing that I did have issues that I realized that bunker, my fortress, had become my prison, so to speak, because I wouldn't let anything in, I wouldn't let anything out. I was just trapped in my own fortress that I didn't realize I no longer needed. Because, you know, if you're hyper vigilant for 365 days, you learn it so well that number one, you don't realize it's there, and number two, you don't realize you no longer need it. And so it takes a while to start dismantling that bunker, you know. And unfortunately, some guys turn to different ways of self-medicating, either isolation, drugs, alcohol, violence, because that was your go-to for so long. And when you get out, you know, it's like you go through 10 weeks of basic training when you get into the service. Then you go through a few months of AIT where you perfect your chosen occupation in the military. Then we went to Vietnam. We had 2 weeks of jungle training, and all that training, and then you practice that for 12 months, and there's no training. Nobody tells you that you no longer need to be hypervigilant. You no longer have to be full of rage and, you know, anger and being an animal. Nobody told us that you know, you're going to have these issues when you're in the civilian life, and nobody gave us any idea of what kind of resources. Back then, there were no resources available to help you readjust into life after combat. We had to figure it out all on our own. So, you know, and again, that's one of my purpose in putting that book together. The second book is I want people to understand, even our families, our wives, our children, our ex-wives, the reason why we had such difficulty socially is because there wasn't anything to help us, and we just had to figure it out ourselves. And some of us figured it out. And that's what convinced me now that surviving a war or combat, whether you get injured or not, it's a gift. And I realize now it's a gift that shouldn't be wasted, that it's a gift that can be used to help others who struggle, because, you know, we who went through it, we know. we were, you know, living proof. So anyways, sorry, got a little off track there.
One of the coping mechanisms, did you develop kind of a coping mechanism where you didn't want to really get close to anybody while you were over there? You didn't want to know about them personally, didn't want to let them in as a friend or anything, because, you know, chances are they're going to get killed, and that would just you know, if you knew about their families and knew about their children and things like that. Uh, so did you do that where you just kind of withdrew from those people you were around then, and then did that carry over later after you got out?
Yes, that's exactly what it was when you're over there. Just dovetail off what you're saying. Yeah, I when you learn too much about their civilian life, their serving, you get too close to them, and then when you lose them, it hurts too much because they became your friend. You knew their history. You knew, people that are waiting for them to come home. So yeah, I got to a point where I didn't want to make any new friends when we got new replacements, especially being the squad leader or any type of leadership position. I only wanted to know their name. I only wanted to know if I could depend on them in a fight, and I only wanted to know if I could depend on them to stay awake at night in the boot. The only reason why you really want to know their name is so that you know who to ask to walk point, go on an ambush, or know their name so you can identify their body and identify their personal belongings to be sent home. Um, and I learned that and practiced that so much, so often that even after getting out, I I didn't even realize that I was choosing not to make friends because I practiced it and became who I was. You learn not to allow yourself to feel deeply, to care too much, to share too much, or to love too deeply, um, which made it difficult for relationships, either with friends or somebody that I thought I'd want to have a romantic relationship with. Even in your work environment, you want to get. Oh, there we go. Um, yeah, and looking now, one of the things I'm not too proud of, it was a fact, is from getting out of the service to retiring, I've had 27 jobs. And whenever I thought that the job was something to enjoyable with, I would move on. Whenever I was in a relationship, even friends with guys, whenever I felt like I was starting to care too much, I would start, I guess, inventing some reason for dissatisfaction, and I would move on. It was always like whenever overseas, you learn that whenever you start enjoying something that's fun, um, you start believing that it's only a prelude to some kind of heartache, mayhem, disappointment. So don't get too happy. Don't have too much fun because that's just a red flag that something horrible is going to happen. And it's a horrible way to live, but it's more of a tragic thing to try to unlearn. Um, but and again, that's why a lot of us don't want to talk about what we did. Partly because we don't realize that how it's affected us. We just think this is my normal. But again, I am living proof that there is hope, there is change, there is, you know, freedom from the shackle of PTSD.
So as you
And
started writing your books, that kind of gave you
mhm.
uh, some healing as you were writing down that and comparing it to the scriptures, and then knowing that people are going to read that and it's going to help them start dealing with some of the
Mhm.
things they have going on. Do you do any like group sessions where you just sit down with other guys and talk and encourage them that
um,
went through similar things that you did?
I, Yes, and I have a few friends that we get together and we talk about it. And somebody suggested doing some kind of ministry at church for combat veterans, and that's something that's kind of learner because know how many other people are in the same thing. I am still in contact with two Army buddies that we served with over in Vietnam. One guy named Gary, another guy's named Jim. Um, and we are in contact almost several times a week, actually, either phone call or text or email. We just, after, almost 60 years, we're still in touch. And both of them suffer with PTSD. Um, and you know, it's hard for me to, um, knowing how I've come around and found peace and wanting it so bad for them because, I know what they went through. We went through it together. Um, and they recently both copied my book and started reading it. And one of them who had his stomach basically ripped open from an explosion that killed one of my best friends. Um, when talking to him, his accident happened, his injury happened on March 16th, 1966, 68. And every year on March 16th, I'll call him and make sure he's okay. And I know he's having a bad time. Most of the time when I talk to him, he's either drunk or high because he has to numb out especially on the 16th. Anyway, I talked to him last Monday, the 16th, and he chose not to read my book until the 16th, and he read it with his wife. And he said he started crying, and he remembered things that he'd buried for all these years. And, and I said, but are you okay? And he said, thank you so much for writing that, because now, it still bothers me, but it doesn't determine what my day's going to look like anymore. If I want that peace. So,
And that goes back to, I think, to Rick's
one that
point.
is working. Now, my other friend, Gene.
So, Tony, I think that goes back to what Rick said was there's, there are some churches that have started veteran Bible studies.
Mm-hmm.
And what a powerful way to help other men, or even, there are unfortunately, there are women combat veterans today, but to help other combat veterans
Yes.
deal with that, what a blessing that would be to them. If God's calling you to do it, he's going to keep calling you until you finally relent anyway. So,
Absolutely.
as long as you're listening to that, it's going to happen if that's what he wants. Right. But I have heard such good things about these veteran Bible studies at different churches.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing too, not only that, but first responders. A good friend of mine from church, he retired after 30 years with the fire department. And he's told me some of the things that, he has witnessed and he has to deal with. My tour was only 12 months. His was 30 years of that. There were some good things, but a lot of bad things. And simultaneously, his wife worked as a nurse manager in an emergency department for, 20 some odd years. And
Wow.
Just to imagine how she would have a horrible day, come home and find out that he had a horrible day. How does your marriage survive those kinds of trauma, all those years? And they both credit it to just knowing the Lord.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there's definitely, a need for more emotional support and spiritual support. And I'm not a counselor. I'm not a psychologist. But yes, if that's where God calls me, then, especially after writing these books, I realized like I don't have what it takes to do it, but he does. So yeah, I'll go.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that your
But
books
I
are
don't want
going
I don't want to be doing it from, yeah. Well, and even if it helps just one person, then mission accomplished, So
yeah.
somebody will shake my hand up in heaven and say thank
Well,
you.
I'm sure that your mission's already accomplished, because I know that
What a ride.
there's several people that have probably benefited and read your book and started working on their healing. But with that book, as you cast that out on the water, there's going to
Yeah,
be so many people that you'll never meet and you'll never know that you made a difference in their life and in their family's life, because that
right.
PTS, it doesn't just affect the person
Yeah,
going through it, but it affects the family. And with the first responders and then the healthcare workers,
absolutely.
there's a lot of emotional uh, things that go on, and you see a lot of death and dying and traumatic injuries, and that's stuff that you can't unsee, and you carry that with you. So, uh,
No.
you're on the right track for sure. I mean, God's
Yeah.
given you these, your healing process to where you could, reduce it to writing so you can share it. And tell us how people can find your books. Give us the name of them and tell them where they can find
Mhm.
those books.
Okay. Well, they're both Amazon, Barnes Nobles, and there's also online Christian bookstores that they carried. I'm not sure which ones, but the first book was it's called Parables from Combat, and that was the one about that reminded me of something that had to do with military or war, things like that. And the second one is called CPR from Combat, and CPR stands for Christ's Peace Restoration from Combat. Um, and again, they can both be found in Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. Um, I even did a search for CPR from Combat, and it even showed up in China and
Wow.
Australia.
That's
Um,
good.
a friend of mine said, "Wouldn't that be something if somebody in Vietnam picked up a copy and read?" Because in the book I even mentioned, it never dawned on me: are Americans the only ones that suffer from PTSD, or do do my former enemies have PTSD? You know, and which made me think, wow, it caused them to have those issues, and that didn't sit well with me. But if something like the book can find its way into one of my former enemies' hands, wow, imagine what that would be like.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's just mind-boggling what the possibilities are.
Mm.
But like I said, if it affects just one or two people's eternity, then wow, what an honor. And I don't need to know, who or how many. It just,
Right.
like I said, I
Right.
could look in the mirror now and I'm okay with the man I see.
Yeah. We
That,
definitely want to get you to speak at a
You know,
luncheon.
and you asked earlier, oh, signal keeps kind of going in and out. I was going to say, Ricky, you mentioned something about, how it affects family and stuff like that. And I know when I first had two daughters from my first marriage, and those were in the days when I was still trying to find who the heck I'm supposed to be or how I'm supposed to be. Oh, I was, not the best father. I wasn't. I was absent. Put it that way, emotionally absent for most of the part. I put on this facade of being a funny, happy guy, but deep down inside, I was just restless, trying to figure out again, just to be, what am I supposed to do? And, unfortunately, like I said, I was kind of an emotionally absent father, and he divorced their mother and moved around, and in my search for, what I thought would be happiness. And fortunately, praise God, since then, I mean, I've, I get it. I don't think they really ever understood why I was the way I was. And so hopefully, if and when they read the book, it'll help them understand that it wasn't them, and it wasn't really the person that I am now, and maybe it'll give them a little bit more insight into, why I wasn't the father that was more nurturing to them. So,
But it all started whenever your daughter started going to church, correct?
my stepdaughter, I call her my
Yeah,
bonus daughter. Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
So just from a child getting that experience and being consistent and bringing it back into the home,
Mhm.
it changed your life and
and
your whole
it's
future.
it too was because yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's and going through the journey of writing the book. I mean, I had to stop several times and take a breath or go outside and cry or something because all of a sudden a trap door would be unwelded, and I'd say, oh wow, I was that way, or I did this, or, yeah. But it was very, very therapeutic. It wasn't easy. It was, you know, like I said, heavy at times. But man, I'll tell you what, it was just so therapeutic to. Um, Sorry to say, but it's like a real painful pimple that you have to pop and get the junk out. But
That's,
yeah,
but that's what we hear a lot from a lot of the veterans is that once you let it out, once it gets
hmm
light, then you can move past it, because when we keep these things
yes,
in and we hold on to them for dear life, they continue to impact our lives in ways that we don't know and we don't understand until we finally let it go.
exactly,
And then
yeah.
guess what? It's not so
hmm
scary anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 Then
And
you
it
can
and it doesn't
heal.
happen overnight, but yeah, at least there is a process and there is hope at
Right.
And you're living proof.
the
I
old
mean,
light at the end of the tunnel. So
yeah, you're living proof
yeah,
that
what a ride.
there can be healing. And uh, do you still have things that bubble up every once in a while? That those iron doors open with another memory or something, and you have to deal with it.
I do, but the thing is it's something that I love. I love watching army pictures, and people think, well, are you crazy? But or anything. If I know if I know what's coming, I'm okay. 4th of July, New Year's Eve with fireworks and things like that. It's when something that I'm not expecting pops up. It does catch me. For instance, like the movie Forrest Gump. You know, well, I thought, well, that's going to be a nice, fun movie to watch, but had no idea the Vietnam scene was going to pop up. And I had to go walk outside and catch my. I thought, wow, I'm ready for that. For instance, now though, they uh, don't send me into a any kind of depression or anger in that. When something like that pops up, I'm just that it may still be there, but it isn't an open wound. It doesn't hurt. It's not infected. It's not going to determine my peace and joy for the rest of the day. You know, and it just actually it kind of reminds me to just be thankful that I did survive, and um, I was able to use that experience to help somebody else You know, one of the messages that I heard in our church, the Sunday morning message, that Pastor talking about suffering and about how God doesn't cause it and all that. But the one thing that he said that really stuck with me was that in God's hand, he will add purpose to it. And I'd like to think that I'm living proof of that. He's added purpose to my flashbacks, to my nightmares, to my PTSD and all that. Purpose to it. And, you know, good with that.
And that's something that, you know, all those times you were getting shot at and seeing people get around you get hurt or killed, you know, God protected you because he had on down the road, I think he knew that you were going to be a vessel to share your story to help other people.
That is, you know, it's funny. Out of the 42 people in the original platoon that when we left Fort Hood to ship over, I think it's either me and maybe 4 or 5 of us from the original Fort Hood platoon didn't get killed or wounded. Wow. My brother he spent 8 months over there before me in infantry. He did not get wounded. Of course, you know, he had a bunch of Agent Orange issues. You know, and the odds were really against me. But even when I died, God, even, and I'm ashamed to say, he cursed God, he still did not abandon me. You know, he knew he could use somebody like me to help somebody else. Exactly what you're saying. You know, and I think that's what made me so grateful for, and it sounds funny having gone through what I did, but how he is using it. And you know, anytime God says, you know what, I want to use you to do something, what an honor, what a blessing, you know. And even though we may not feel qualified or prepared, you know, I've eventually learned, don't be afraid, just say yes.
That's right. And there's a lot of stories in the Bible about those people that weren't qualified, but, you know, God took them and did miraculous things with them.
Yep. God doesn't call the equipped.
Yep.
The equipped
I kind of lost
call.
the signal there.
Yep.
Lost what you said.
Oh, repeat what you said, Mary.
Wow. That's good. Yes, it is. That's true.
Well, Tony, our time's up today, but we just appreciate you being with us today. And in our description of the podcast, we've got the names of your books. You can find those at Amazon. And you need to start bringing some of those to roll call and let some of our veterans buy those books so they can I'm sure a lot of them from Vietnam are really going to identify with what you describe and, you know, helping their healing too. So.
Yeah. Well, and the plan is going to be, I'm going to try to book Tony to speak for a luncheon and then bring both books and let us know ahead of time what the cost per book is. And we'll advertise that along with it. And you can sell books after the luncheon ends, like we let everybody do that has a book when they speak. But people will love to line up and have you autograph those books for them right there at the luncheon. And what a great gift, because our largest group is our Vietnam veterans, and many of them are combat veterans.
Yeah. You know, and it's funny, even those that weren't in combat but were there, they saw a lot of things that they can't unsee. They had a lot of fears that they, you know, had to deal with. So not just combat veterans, like I said, them, first responders and so forth. Yeah. So what an honor to even be considered to do something like that.
Yeah. Well, it would be our honor to have you.
Yeah. You too, for being the kind of patriots and caring veterans that would make it. Yeah. If I was physically able, I would go ahead and fight all over again for you guys.
We appreciate
But
what you
know,
did.
they don't give you time out to take a nap. Yeah.
But we will see
Well, like I
you.
said, for people who. Yep.
Yeah,
I lost you.
we will see you Friday at roll call.
Absolutely, I will be there.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your journey from combat to faith to healing. So,
Thank you for
Tony,
having me.
God bless you, and we just pray that you'll continue to reach out and help other veterans and first responders deal with the things that have bogged them down for so many years.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
We'll see you.
Well,
Friday.
thank you again for having me. It's an honor and a blessing. See you Friday. Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Wow.
You just see people every month at roll call, and you don't know what they've been through.
Nope, that's why I always say everyone has a story, and everyone matters.
But to hear the stories that Tony shared, I mean, you think about. I mean, we just heard a little bit of his story. You just think about the men that died or the men that were injured, and he was responsible for a squad every day when they went out. So
yeah, that's quite the weight to bear at the young age, because we've talked about before, as we're coming up here very soon on Vietnam Veteran Day, we talk about the difference between World War II and Vietnam, and the average age was much younger in Vietnam, and the average time in combat was incredibly longer. So you do some comparisons there, and there were a lot of young men leading other young men into battle, and they have been carrying scars for a very long time.
And what we roll call might consider doing is to kind of have an online or something where we can list all the books and show those veterans in their books with, say you could buy these books at Amazon or whatever. But I think that'd be good because we have so many people that have written so many books, I mean, Doug Peterson and his books, and Tank Gunner and his books, and there's a lot of people that have written books.
I have a whole bunch of them because people give me books all the time. I can't read them all.
And I've got a whole lot of books that I have read about World War II and Vietnam, and there's some places where I think we could donate those books to veteran groups or something, that after we've read them, so others can enjoy them.
Yep, yeah, that's true. But he reminded me a lot of Don Graves and some of the things that he said when he talked about the way that you dealt with it, how much longer after, because Don always says we didn't have PTS. Well, yeah, you just called it shell shock. And, for the 9 years between the time he made that promise on the beach and the time that he turned his life over to Jesus, he tells you how he was living his life. And it's clear that there was some stuff going on there. But they didn't call it that, and they didn't think about it that way. But clearly the stories that he tells about some of the guys that came back that he served with, they were dealing with it too. And so right now he should be arriving in Guam. Speaking of Don Graves, he is headed back to Iwo Jima. So on the 28th of March, they will allow the Americans on the island one day a year, and Don will be there. It's probably been, I think he's gone one other time, and I don't know how long ago it was, but it was sometime since he got here to Texas that he went with Laura Leppert, and he is going to return this time, and he's got all kinds of big plans about what he's going to do. We'll see what he can actually do.
Oh,
But his son went in my place. His son wanted to accompany him, so I gave up my spot as his caregiver so that his son could have this experience with him, because that's the right thing to do. It's his son.
absolutely.
It's his son. So I'm hoping that they have a great experience and get some good father-son bonding time.
Yeah, because there's never a better time than something like that when you can go appreciate that's where Dad was. That's the things he saw and the things he did, and actually step on that beach where Don stepped.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So it'll be good to hear some stories from Don when he comes back. We always do. So we'll make sure that we get some of that, and hopefully Tracy will send us some videos along the way that we can share with our audience.
I know she will.
Yep.
And, there's so many other veterans out there, regardless of, Vietnam or peacetime or Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia. But there's so many of them that need to start kind of internalizing and start writing their stories down. If they, start writing their stories down and then share some of those stories with somebody you can confide in, or with your family, or even at roll call, or contact us and share them on the podcast, because it's very therapeutic. And just like Tony, he wasn't out there to say, "Oh, I'm going to write a book to help all these people." Things just happen. He started dealing with things, and all of a sudden he's got books that others can learn from and start a healing process, because it's never too late to get out there and start dealing with that. Because you think about people like Tony, and you think about the millions of other people that have suffered things like he did in combat, that never get any healing. They spend a lifetime of drugs, alcohol, or whatever, and they never reach that Tony's reached. So
Yeah.
I just appreciate him so much for sharing his story with us.
Yeah. Amen. And I'm going to make sure that we get him set up to speak at a lunch.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
And, like Mary said, roll calls this week, and we've got Errol Flannery, who is going to be David Crockett for us, I think.
Yeah. Going to have that reenactment. I'm looking forward to it. And we are on a wait list. So we filled all the seats in 2 hours. And currently I've got a couple more people that added today. So I'm still probably about 15 people or so on the wait list. But here in the next couple of days is when people start letting me know they're not feeling well, or something last minute came up, or, a death in the family or whatever. But these next couple of days, Wednesday and Thursday, are when I get the vast majority of the cancellations. So those on the wait list usually clear. I haven't had any problem most months clearing everybody off the wait list. So if you still wish to come, again, you can email us at info@roll-call.org, and we'll do our best to get you on there. But if you're not already a member, and membership is free, go to our website at roll-call.org and sign up to be a member, and you'll get notifications when we send out the email to RSVP for the lunch.
And that's where you go in, sign up, so you can start getting those newsletters, so you'll know when the reservation line opens. So,
and there's other good information in those newsletters, and I know not a lot of people click them and open them, but Jeff has gotten really good at putting together a great newsletter, very interactive, lots of good information. So go on out there and check it out.
Okay. And we'll see you next week on Hometown Heroes. And we thank you for being a part of this. God bless you and God bless America.